Weave it together. Come along, come along, come along.
Are people WhatsApping me saying they can't get in?
Mending it together. A world on fire.
Hi, admitting people.
We're gonna mend
Wanda, will you be admitting people?
it together. A stitch in time is gonna save nine. A stitch in time is gonna save nine. And I wanna be a catalyst for change. Trying something different. I wanna change the rules of the game. 'Cause even the smallest bird can fly up to the top of the tree. And I wanna be a catalyst and find out what could be.
Actually, leave it open because it gives light on my face. Thank you.
Catalyst 2030 concentrated its efforts on bringing proximate leaders and frontline solutions to the forefront. Collaborations led by members from the Global South produce groundbreaking reports on climate and transforming education. Welcome to Catalyzing Change Week. This year's Catalyzing Change Week is about solutions from the front lines by social innovators. In 2022, Catalyst 2030 concentrated its efforts on bringing proximate leaders and frontline solutions to the forefront. Collaborations led by members from the Global South produce groundbreaking reports on climate and transforming education, with an emphasis on offering local solutions. We continued our mission to create an enabling environment for social entrepreneurs to flourish by initiating a letter to donors, signed by more than 1,200 social entrepreneurs and innovators. The Catalyst 2030 Awards ceremony.
Hello, everyone. Wando, I think some people are having trouble getting into the session. Just give it a minute. Hi, everybody. We're just waiting for a few more people to show up. It's wonderful to see familiar faces, to see friends from past and present, for what we think will be a really wonderful and insightful session today. I keep getting a lot of notes that saying people are having trouble getting in, so I don't want to be distracted. So I guess I will go ahead and get started, and people will just keep coming in as we go. My name is Christine Pearson, and I'm your moderator for what I know will be a really inspiring discussion on female leadership in the social sector. From most of the people that I see that are joining, they're in the social sector. I grew up in California, and I immigrated to South Africa more than 30 years ago, so I've lived most of my life here. My parents had no ambition for me. They wanted me, especially my mother, wanted me to type well and become a legal secretary so I could marry a lawyer. And failing that, I could join the military, so I'd have steady employment. So after I graduated from university with a degree in textiles, I had a career as a consultant. I was an executive with a banking group in South Africa. And then 24 years ago, I founded a nonprofit social enterprise called Lifeline Energy. It was called something else differently then. And little did I know that I was becoming a social entrepreneur because I'd never heard of the term at the time. So Lifeline Energy designs, manufactures, and distributes solar and wind-up media players and radios. Our footprint mainly is across sub-Saharan Africa. And over this time period, we've distributed more than 700,000, reaching somewhere between 22 and 25 million listeners, the most vulnerable, mainly women and girls and refugees. I also handle have a startup side hustle called Lisa Communications, and we do website design, graphics, writing, and editing, mainly for other social enterprises, including Catalyst 2030. So I've been very lucky that my job has taken me to 35 African countries. And to this day, radio remains the most used communication medium across the continent, in spite of the advance of the mobile phone. And just bear with me while I get on this as we get started. This is our panel. I'll introduce them in a moment. I love this quote: behind every successful woman is a tribe of other successful women who have her back. Now, in my world, this is what African leadership looks like. Amene is a Gabra leader from Ethiopia. She belongs to a nomadic community. In her language, woman leader doesn't even exist as a word. Lala is a Tuareg from Niger. She's a community leader and listening group leader. She's trained as a radio journalist and creates and broadcasts programs that are relevant to nomadic and pastoral women in the country that still has the world's highest birth rate. Mariah came to the Dadaab refugee camp from Somalia when she was 16 years old, had her 9 children there, 8 of whom were girls. She became an FGM activist when her husband she didn't want to cut any of her girls, and her husband refused it. And he kidnapped 2 of his daughters and had them cut. So she became an activist. And Agnes is a Maasai woman leader in Kenya who's 3 parts when Agnes around, because she has an incredible track record of rescuing girls from not only FGM, but early marriage. And so these women are not factored into the social leadership sector globally. So if there are only 27% of women in leadership positions globally, and this is the highest sector of all that has women in leadership. So we're led by Canada, which probably isn't surprising. Other fairly developed countries are inching towards 50% leadership, whereas there are quite a few that have a long way to go. The sources for this, I'm sure they're not absolutely accurate, but the sources that I've looked at are very reliable. But what it also doesn't say is that up to 80% of the social sector workforce are women. And so this is what is happening to women. Why aren't more reaching top leadership positions? And hopefully that's something that we'll explore. So I wanted to, we talk about shifting the narrative, especially in Africa, and I know it's spoken about in other parts of the world as well. But what about visual? Now, a couple of years ago, I moderated a session on women social entrepreneurs in Africa. And so I looked at what Google was saying, what Google Images was saying. So for women social entrepreneurs, they were selling fruits and vegetables or other items in markets or by the side of the road, whereas an entrepreneur, which was assumed to be a male, had a nice suit on with a white shirt behind a computer. So the images were really starkly different. So I wanted to see what women in social sector leadership positions look like. And I found this very interesting because many of them are in the Amy Cuddy position, that you know is this, the fake it till you make it position.
Chrissy, so sorry. I think there's a problem with your slides. Could you reshare?
How do I do that? Oh. Sorry. How, when you say reshare? Ah, okay, hold on. So you didn't see any of my slides?
You were very descriptive.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that. I didn't realize that. So these are the 4 women that I mentioned, that what African leadership looks like to me. So you can see their faces and see who they are. And when I think of African women leadership, this is what I think of. When you look at the map will have made no sense without you looking at it. I really apologize. That Canada leads the way, but look at how appalling some of these numbers are. And I have to consider that the sources of this information is relatively accurate. And when you think of 65 to 70% of women, 65 to 80% of workforces in social sector are enormous, that there's a big, big gap. So as I was saying, that I wanted to look at what visually social sector leader looked like. And this is what Google is saying. Now, these are vectors, but again, most women are wearing high heels. I'm not sure what some of these mean. There's a nice white woman helping a Black woman up a ladder or up a hill. And many are in this Amy Cuddy position of arms folded or on the waist. Further exploration, and it's a lot of time spending looking on the internet, seeing what your options are. This had more variety. It had different sizes. There seemed to be a lot more representation in diversity, but I didn't see anywhere on anything a pregnant woman or a woman who was disabled. And so is this, again, what social sector women's leadership look like? And I'll just say very, very briefly, when you look for if you want to see Indian women, you have to look at India, and this very specifically. So you see the women in the photograph are all well-known leaders, but also, again, they're in the position of the Amy Cuddy position. So who's ever creating these, this is either their point of view and or this is what Google thinks people will buy. And so I think there's quite a lot to do on that. And in the Indian and the African social sector leadership situation, it's very much the same. The one thing that kind of did disturb me, however, though, is that when I plugged this in, many, many vectors of Africa Day came up with very stereotypical images. They're very attractive, but they're quite craft oriented. And so I think as let me stop the share. There we go. We as women don't need to think just about the narrative, but also what is the visual. So I'm going to move on and introduce our panelists. So the first panelist, I'm going to introduce all 3 of them and then turn the floor over to them. So our first one is Anita Bhatia. She grew up in Calcutta. She attended university there and then went on to earn a master's degree from Yale and a PhD in law or a law degree from Georgetown. Anita has chosen an institutional leadership path. She has a distinguished career with the World Bank Group, including the IFC, and served in many countries around the world, as well as in headquarters. In 2019, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres appointed Anita as Deputy Secretary General of UN Women, a position she stepped down from on Sunday. She's starting a new career path, which I'll let her share with you, which will be absolutely wonderful and very needed. Now we have serendipity on our panel as well, because Anita and Ruchira Gupta, who's joined us from a car, it looks like, attended the same high school together in Calcutta. So I'm sure their paths have crossed many times over the years, and they've known each other for several decades. So Ruchira is an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker. She's a journalist. Oh, the list is so long. And she's founder of Apni App in India, an NGO. It's a grassroots organization that empowers marginalized girls and women to resist and end sex trafficking. She's also an occasional professor at NYU. And if that's not enough, Ruchira is a best-selling author, and she's just released a book I'm looking forward to reading called I Kick and I Fly, which is a hopeful and inspirational story of triumph about a girl in Bihar, India, who escapes being sold into the sex trade. And you can get that on Amazon. And finally, I'm thrilled to have on our panel Catalyst founder member, which I am as well, I meant to mention that, a Nigerian UK social entrepreneur, Bio Adjalada, who founded and heads Do It Now, a pioneering NGO in the field of Black empowerment in the UK and in Africa. It provides data that decision makers need to effectively fund and support Black change makers and communities. Bio is also on the board of the Princess Trust. Now, I don't know how that changes after Saturday and the coronation, maybe you know. And Bio was named by Pioneers Post as one of the top women social entrepreneurs in the UK, and she holds double master's degrees from LSE in research. And so on that note, I'm going to turn over to Anita and ask you to share your personal leadership journey. What have been the challenges? What has excited you? What's gotten in your way and how you've overcome it. So over to you, Anita.
Thank you, Christine. And let me just say how very wonderful it is to be on this panel with Baya and Ruchi, and to have an opportunity to hear from you, Christine, of what you have been doing to visualize social sector leadership. I really enjoyed looking at those slides, and just when you think you can't be shocked by data anymore, you look at the data and it gives you this moment of pause and an aha moment, which requires you to really realize and think once again just how far we have to go. I'll start with the question on what excites me, because I really like to focus on what is working and what can work and how to scale things up that do work, while being very pragmatic about challenges that do exist. So I think I have always been excited in the work that I have chosen to do about the ability of having very tangible impact on the lives of people. And you might say that, when you're in a large institution, that chain of that transmission chain of impact can be a little attenuated, because it's not as if you are, like an NGO that is in the field and seeing everything firsthand at a very grassroots level. Some of the work that you described of the women, the African leaders, and what social leadership looks like to you in Africa, have very direct experiences of working on impact. But the power of the large institutions that I have been in is a bit different, and it is power, because it is both policy advice about what can be done in terms of regulations, normative frameworks, standards, and laws that impact people's lives. But it is also about then combining policy advice with finance, so that not only are you in one of these institutions advising governments on what they should do to achieve, for example, the SDGs, but then you are providing financing that helps to speed that process along. Now, just to be clear, this is not the only intervention that is powerful and impactful in terms of changing people's lives. But it is true that when you work at a place like the World Bank, you can see how changes in legal environments, in regulatory frameworks, in policies can be extremely influential in changing people's lives. And then when you look at rates of poverty reduction and how countries have moved out of poverty and have grown, you realize that a lot of this has to do with having the right frameworks in place. And that's where not just the World Bank, but other institutions become very powerful. And my journey has taken me, as you know, from a large financing institution like the World Bank and IFC to IFC, because I worked first on the public sector side, but also on the private sector side. And I want to say a word about that, because when you look at what constitutes GDP in most countries, most of it comes from the private sector. So business, small business, big business, has a very important role to play. And if we are not influencing business to be a good social actor, then we are missing a very important stakeholder. And so IFC, which is the world's largest investor in emerging markets, actually has a very powerful role to play. And I really enjoyed being in an institution which was helping to grow businesses, because businesses create jobs, they create employment, and they, through their actions, send signals to the rest of the world on what are good actions or bad actions. And then, of course, UN Women, being the world's only multilateral entity in the entire global multilateral ecosystem with a specific mandate on gender equality and women's empowerment, has an incredibly important role to play in terms of policy advice, regulatory frameworks, normative frameworks, advocacy, pushing for the right laws, pushing for the wrong laws to be eliminated, pushing for attention by governments to issues which are very often swept under the carpet. And so, I think these roles have allowed me to both be a very powerful advocate for the right sets of policies, but also influential with other stakeholders, including the private sector, civil society, think tanks, and others in the ecosystem, because the problems we're trying to solve, whether it's the Sustainable Development Goals overall or a particular Sustainable Development Goal, SDG 5 on gender equality, these problems are just too big and too complex for any one set of institutions or stakeholders to solve by themselves. So they can only be done through a multi-stakeholder approach. And so I believe the ecosystem has place for everyone, whether it is the social entrepreneur, the NGO, civil society, private sector, the public sector, everybody has a role to play. And I just feel very privileged and very grateful to have had, these amazing opportunities in these different roles to try to influence the ecosystem. And now in my newest role, now that I have left UN Women and retired from the United Nations system, I intend to continue my work on impact and to do that through the Impact Collaborative, which is something that is in the process of being created. It will focus on gender equality issues, but will do so by looking at those sectors that have the potential for great impact on gender equality and women's empowerment. I think I said at the outset, Christine, that I think some of the most important sectors for this are technology, media, finance, and attention to gender and climate change issues. So the Impact Collaborative will offer convening, strategic advisory work, and capacity building on those issues. I haven't talked about challenges, but I am also mindful of time and the need to hear from others. So if you like, I'm happy to say a few words on, what some of the challenges have been. But maybe you want to hear from the others first, and I can come back to the issue of challenges.
Okay, well, we'll address that as a as a collective as well. But I think as I was listening to you speak, that so much of what you're saying plays very much into Catalyst 2030, because it's all about collaboration. It's all about getting multi-stakeholder collaborations together to make a lasting impact, whether it's to achieve to progress the SDGs, or whether it's to create systems change. So I think we're all in alignment in that regard. Okay, so Ruchira, over to you and your interesting leadership journey.
Namaste, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be on a panel with Anita, who was my senior in high school. And I always looked up to her. We were Girl Guides together, and we would learn how Anita did things in a guide camp, and I would follow. So it's fun to be on a panel together after all these years. But now, it's also great to broaden the conversations we were learning about leadership in our high school to, across the world, with people from Africa, with people from Asia, with people from the United States, where I am right now in New York. And my own journey as a leader began when I was a journalist. I was reporting on, I was hiking through the hills of Nepal when I came across rows of villages with missing girls. And as a good journalist, I ended up making a documentary on the subject. And I won an Emmy for outstanding investigative journalism. But the documentary was on sex trafficking, and it had taken me into the brothels of Mumbai, where I saw little girls between the ages of 9 and 15 locked up in small rooms, exploited for many years. And I was sad and angry and determined to do something about it. So when I was in New York receiving the award, I could see the eyes of the women who had told their stories in my documentary beyond the glittering lights. And I just wanted to do more. I decided then and there that I would use my Emmy and my documentary not to build a career in journalism, but to make a difference. And that's how my leadership journey began, because I went back to the women and started an NGO called Apne Aap. And they had 4 dreams at that time. They said they wanted to save their daughters from the same destiny they had, which is sex trafficking and prostitution. They wanted school for their children. That was their first dream. Second was they wanted a job which was safe from violence, because prostitution is based on body invasion, and there's a lot of violence associated with it. And the third thing they wanted was a room of their own. And I was an English literature student, so it was great to hear Virginia Woolf among the most marginalized women. And by that, they meant somewhere where they could be safe and sleep, and their children would not be molested. And the fourth thing they wanted was, they said they wanted punishment of their perpetrators, justice, and that, justice against those who had bought them and sold them and brokered away their dreams. So I began Apne Aap. That was my business plan. I also took my documentary to the UN and to the US Congress and used it to change laws. That time there was no Trafficking Victim Protection Act. That time there was no UN protocol to end trafficking in persons. And I used the documentary to tell a story. And that I can now proudly say I played a role in what is now the TVPA and the UN protocol to end trafficking. So my leadership was based on law by law, girl by girl. And I still believe in the power of storytelling from the grassroots up, which is why I have a new book out called I Kick and I Fly, which is about a young girl who escapes sex trafficking because, she's also from a nomadic tribe, like one of the girls you mentioned in your opening slide, dirt poor, homeless, could become homeless, hungry. And, the traffickers, of course, choose on the most vulnerable to prey upon. So, my book shows how she becomes a Kung Fu champion with the help of the women's rights advocate who enrolls her in a Kung Fu program in that village. And it's based on a true story, because I began writing I Kick and I Fly when something like this happened in my NGO in Apne Aap. A girl won a gold medal in karate. And so I believe in the power of storytelling to bring about change. But I also believe that change begins at the bottom and transforms the top, because through the work that I did, I saw that time I didn't even know if it would succeed or not succeed. But I did it because I wanted to make a difference. And 20 years later, I can report that I have helped more than 20,000 women escape systems of exploitation. Thousands of girls have finished school and college for the first time in 3 generations or 5 generations of their family ever. And, more girls are learning Kung Fu and Karate and becoming the champions they should be. So for me, change begins at the bottom, transforms the top. When you do something, it doesn't matter whether it's big or small, you have to do it as if it matters. Only time shows what is big or small. What is big or small. And also the other thing that I learned was the power of women's collective action, because I couldn't have done it alone. When I went to the UN, I had friends who set it up for me. And when I went to speak at the US Congress, again, I had friends and allies of other NGO women leaders who set that up for me and paved the way. The same thing happened when I was running Apne Aap. I couldn't have done it alone. I could do it because I had women who were willing to fight back in the community, the mothers of the girls who they wanted to educate and didn't want the same destiny as them. And I might not even have finished making the documentary if my life had not been saved by the women in prostitution who had surrounded me when I was filming in a brothel in Bombay when a man pulled out a knife at me and said, if you want to kill her, you've got to kill us first, because we are all in this together and we want to break our silence and she's going to help us. And so I learned the power of women's collective action in that moment. And that is what my NGO has gone on replicating. All those lessons that I learned, change begins at the bottom, the collective strength of women, forming circles of women. And of course, with Catalyst today, I can see that you are talking about very large scale data, which is so important because it shows us that, no woman is alone when she's being oppressed. And the woman is not crazy. It's the system which is crazy. And we have to change it. We have to, what Anita is doing in a very practical and large scale way, getting the money to bring about the systemic changes that are required, setting up chains which can empower women, supply chains, empowerment chains, as I call them, the human chain, as I like to use the phrase. But all these things are what I wanted to share on the panel today, that these are the tips I've learned as a leader, and they are yours to use as you like. Thank you.
That's wonderful, Ruchira. And I love it that the two of you started as Girl Guides. And I think that probably laid a very good foundation of leadership for you, and neither of you knowing which way or your paths would unfold and then continue to intersect over the years. And I also really love that we are all in this together. And that's also very much of the mindset that we need to have to solve the issues that we're all trying to make a dent in. Now, Baya, over to you and your very different journey.
Indeed, very different. But I did also start as a Girl Guide. I was a Girl Guide while I was at school in Nigeria.
How many can I just ask? How many in the audience? Can you put up a hand if you were a Girl Guide? When I was growing up, you were a brownie, I think, which might have been part of the Girl Scouts. Do we have any Girl Guides here? Well, a few. Okay.
Well, first, thank you for this opportunity. And I will say that we're saying women supporting women and also women opening doors for women. Christine is a woman that's opened many doors for me. Is not only the person that invited me into Catalyst, but certainly invited me onto this panel. So I'm very grateful, Christine, and also grateful to share the time with you both. I in such a short time, I've just learned so much, and I'm looking forward to the rest of it. So my journey is recent in that I started Do It Now officially as an organization 3 years ago. And in that time, there was a lot of learning that came into it. And while I always wanted to be a leader, I'd always wanted to do something with my skill set. I never saw myself as someone that was a frontline worker. Both of my best friends are carers to the same person. It's a wonderful piece of trivia to for my own life, but I'm not that person. I'm someone that sits at a desk and analyzes things and talks to people and says, okay, this is what I know, this is what I can do, this is who I need to talk to. And I'd always wanted to be able to use my educational background as a benefit, because I believed that the opportunity for education was one of the biggest gifts my parents had ever given me. Their staunch belief that education was the route to power, to efficacy, to opportunity, to absolutely everything. And I thought, I've always thought it was a very big blessing that I had parents that did that, and recognized that the opportunity and open doors that are available to people that didn't have that upbringing didn't mean that they were any less deserving of a voice or less deserving of the stage. So my goal in using my skill set to support the Black community has always been to ensure that I'm leading by listening. Because of the background that I have, because of the education that I have certain doors open to me, and that was the starting point. What can I do with these opportunity skill sets that would ensure that the people that get overlooked for whatever reason in my community, that are experiencing to the 10th degree the problems that I've experienced as a Black person in the UK, can be listened to. And that's where the research elements of my work came in. I wanted to know why on earth Black people were not being given as much space and time to influence policy, politics, to speak truth to power, to be listened to. And so the work that I do, the work that excites me, is when we get to say, within the past 3 years, we've become the largest repository of information about the Black community in its specificity in the UK. And that allows us to have real conversations about what is happening when it comes to youth unemployment, what is happening when it comes to charities and social enterprises of the Black community. How can we ensure that funding is going to them? How can we ensure that their stories are being understood? If I had the creativity, I too would have tried to make a documentary and use that as an opportunity to advocate for my community even more, because the position that I get to be in now, the growth of our organization and the kind of rooms I get to be in, not least this one, it means that I get to represent all of the people that are believing in me, the organizations that give us their information so that we can knock down doors on their behalf and are hoping for a better tomorrow. I mean, within our community, we support thousands of people a year, and most of them are, the vast majority of them are women. And it's not very often that we find them seeking a better life for themselves. Of course, that's a part of it, but exactly as Ruchir was saying, as Anita was saying, it's about, there's a community that comes with a woman that doesn't really exist in any other, particularly when you're talking about women that are from underrepresented communities or underfunded or undersupported communities. There's this workaround culture that happens that bonds you together and forces you to find community in a way that isn't necessary in more affluent or more supported spaces. And in that community, you find the resources to build in more creative ways and engage in more creative conversations. So I'm grateful for all of the fantastic leaders that I've met through my work that are building startups in the cancer space, or building entrepreneurship programs, or supporting young people to get into employment, or whatever it might be. And my role in all of this is to build a team that has the necessary skills and knowledge that can take all of their stories, all of their data, and then say to the people in power, this is what needs to change, and we're going to keep being here until that change happens.
Thank you, Bayo. Very inspiring. So Anita, you were in talking about the challenges that you've faced on your leadership journey. If you could also share how you overcame them, because this is all about solutions. And so I think people would be very interesting because you more than anybody on the panel have really worked in a very patriarchal culture, I guess, would be a way to state it, but with institutionalized power, and power we know is generally fairly gender-based. So I'm sure you've had your fair share of challenges in that regard.
Oh, yes. So actually, let me talk about two challenges. One is, just thinking through about how one chooses a path and how one has courage of one's convictions. So I have to tell you that when I was at Yale, I started doing research work on what used to be called bombs and rockets. I was a security specialist, and I was working on issues having to do with nuclear, not nuclear weapons, but weapons. And, I had this aha moment when I was in graduate school to say, I'm working on the wrong things. I feel I'm working on the wrong things and I need to change. But it requires quite a lot of courage, actually, and the courage of one's convictions to say, I'm going to stop doing this and I'm going to do something else. And I think one very important lesson is that you need mentors along the way. You do need people who support you when you are, especially if you're making difficult decisions. And I was very blessed because I did have a mentor who was the director of the Economic Growth Center at Yale. And, he really encouraged me to shift paths because I ended up saying, I'm not going to do X and I'm going to do Y instead. And it wasn't an easy decision, but, it was a reminder of when you make those tough choices, if you have somebody who's got your back, or at least giving you some positive reinforcement on what seems to be a difficult and precarious decision, it is helpful. So that's one thing. Second, on the patriarchy, absolutely true. It's much better now, but in the days when I was a director at IFC, I was one of the few women, and certainly one of the few women of color. Leadership was white and male. And, to be a woman in that group of, maybe, I don't know, we may have been 40 directors, and I think there might have been 4 women and maybe 2 women who were, not white. And so I think one of the challenges, again, but everything is about how you respond to the environment, is in a crowd or in a table where you do not look like everybody else, how do you speak and how do you be heard? And, to have the courage of the courage of your convictions, and to know how to speak, when to speak, what to say, to be heard, because people are heard in different ways. And who is saying something really matters. So, I noticed very often in many of the meetings I was in that, especially this one particular person, right, would say something. And I just thought it was not, not pertinent or not, whatever. But nobody ever called, there was a different way of hearing that than there was something that was coming from somebody who didn't look like power. And so I think just being very comfortable in your own skin and just having the courage of your convictions and knowing that what you say has to be said. And, later on, a lot of people said to me when I was picked for successive leadership roles in the organization, I remember I had a mentor and I asked her, why she had picked me for a particular role, because I didn't actually have the technical background for it. And she said, because you speak truth to power, but you do it in a way that that gets heard. So I think one of the lessons along the way is that you have to be able to say what you believe and have the courage of your convictions. But, you also have to be smart about understanding what is the way to say it to be heard, because people get heard differently.
Very true. Very good advice. Thank you, Anita. Ruchira, what have been some of the challenges that you've had, and how have you overcome them?
I have had the similar challenges that Anita talks about, like trying to raise funds from an all-white male world, because that's where the power and the money is. And they would not see sex trafficking as an issue. They would say that men will be men, prostitution is as old as the hills. And I had to take on some of the world's most powerful men on this, who ran foundations, giving millions of dollars to my country to set up health systems. And so I had to also negotiate with people in my own government that, yes, take the money, but at least take it in the way that it benefits the person I call the last girl. And to me, if I just want all of you to shut your eyes for a few seconds and imagine the last girl. The last girl is poor. She is female, she's a teenager. In India, she's from an oppressed caste. And in the United States, she's Black or Native American. In Africa, she could be from a nomadic tribe or ethnicity, which is marginalized. In Europe, a refugee. Think about, how does she access food? How does she access housing? How does she access education? How does she even access protection if somebody wants to reach out for her? And those are the systems that we have to create for the last girl. So sometimes, when there are top-down approaches by the foundations, what happens is they think of something which they can do, which is what they call SMART, S-M-A-R-T, which is specific, measurable, achievable, results-oriented, and time-bound. And what that does is limits what they can do, because they then go for product-driven solutions for human beings who need a holistic, wraparound, lifelong support to get out of entrenched poverty and exploitation, which is often intergenerational. So, in India, for example, in the red light areas where I work, the main programs which were funded were condom distribution programs. And what that did was it saved male buyers from disease, but it did not protect the women and girls from the male buyers, because in the zeal to distribute condoms, what happened was that people were chasing numbers, specific, measurable, achievable, results-oriented, time-bound, all that. So they were actually hiring pimps and brothel keepers to distribute the condoms. And so they made the exploiters more powerful than the exploited. And so that has been one of my biggest challenges over the year, is to define exploitation and explain to the powerful what is exploitation and what is at stake here for us, to understand the last girl. And, beyond that, of course, the other challenge is personal, because listening to so much trauma all the time, because victims of sex trafficking, who I work with across the world now, their lives are predicated on body invasion. Because even if everything else gets legislated away, clean working conditions, condom use, etc., what people are buying is the invasion of their bodies. And even if we go to a dentist, we hate it when someone drills into our teeth. When there's COVID, if someone coughs near us, we feel scared. And imagine intimate contact again and again and again, multiple times for weeks, years, months, what that can do physically and mentally to a person. So, to convey all these issues in the best possible way, and exactly to the point that Anita is talking about, that speak truth to power, but how do you say it so you are heard, is my biggest challenge. So actually what Anita has said, I've learned something that, I have to think about this. I have tried and I have made a difference, of course, with the Selling of Innocence, my documentary, hopefully with my book now, I Kick and I Fly, through the examples and amplification of the survivor stories that I've done straight from the village to the corridors of the UN and Parliament in India to change laws again. But what next? How do we get to the tipping point where we can create a world in which no child is bought or sold?
Wow. What a challenge. And changing systems aren't easy. And it comes back to the same thing, doesn't it? The level of collaboration and cooperation. And it's very clear that you don't take no for an answer very easily.
And I just want to say that, I want to tell all the people who are listening in, because there are people who head foundations and catalysts, and all of you have collaborated together to find this tipping point for all the challenges our world faces. Gandhi would have never, Mahatma Gandhi, who led India's freedom struggle and ended colonization, which had such a ripple effect across the world, including in your own country, South Africa. If he had thought about being smart, S-M-A-R-T, he would have never had the slogan "Quit India." Because at the moment in history when he raised that slogan, there was no way to know if it was time bound and the British were going to leave. They were powerful on horses with red clothes, guns in their hand. It was impossible. And yet he said, "Quit India," and it became a moral aspiration. And people worked towards it, and it galvanized change.
Thank you. Anita, you wanted to
Yeah,
say
I just wanted
something.
to say one other big challenge that I've had in the last few years, and that is, I think, on the issues of gender equality and women's empowerment. The world is so busy focusing on solving so many other complex issues that what I have found, not so much during the pandemic, but in the post-pandemic period, is that for policymakers, the headspace is not there. Because people are so busy dealing with, how do we save our economies from free fall? How do we avert a recession? How do we deal with the existential threat of climate change? That, in all of this, the fact that, the situation of women is actually getting worse and not better is something that is very difficult to put front and center for policymakers. So over the last few years, I spent a lot of time thinking about how do we integrate this into other conversations so that people don't lose sight of this. And then on certain aspects of gender equality, I think we are so inured to certain issues, similar to what Ruchi was describing. The issue of violence against women. I mean, this is a pandemic staring at us in the face, but because it's staring at us in the face, we don't see it. And so, there are certain things happening in the world which are, and I think the problem that Ruchi works on is one of them, that are so common, so old, so entrenched in our societies that you actually cannot see it for what it is. And so one of the biggest challenges I feel that the world has today is on the different, certain aspects of gender equality and women's empowerment, that people have either no headspace or two, are so inured to the issue that they no longer see it for what it is. So actually it really is about changing the narrative, but also constant advocacy to ensure that this remains front and center.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bio, do you have, would you like to weigh in?
Absolutely. They're thinking through the contributions just now. I think it solidified the challenging, gave me a little bit of hope, because I mean, I'm really at the beginning stages of this journey compared to both of your history careers. And the thing that comes to me is I've often described this journey, or at least up until maybe 6 months ago, I often described this journey as almost throwing myself against a brick wall, hoping the wall would break, but what I was breaking instead. And I was dealing with all of this just struggle of like, when is it going to change, and becoming impatient. And what I've done over the past few months is try and walk that back and think, actually, I'm not the only one dealing with this. And that's what my reaction to challenge typically is. If I have a problem, I suddenly think, oh, who else is dealing with this problem? How are they dealing with this problem? And I've just had the most incredible conversations with women over the past few months about how they are navigating the patriarchy. I mean, I found myself kind of connecting myself to powerful men in rooms in order to validate my position. So if I was going to say something, I would try and connect it to someone else's point in order to help solidify my position. So if they weren't necessarily agreeing with me, they were agreeing with him, but at least my point got through. So that kind of, how do I say the thing that I want to say in a way that allows me to navigate the space that I'm in? But then when you think about the intersectionality of it being a woman of a global majority background in a predominantly white space, consistently thinking through everything that you say and how you say it is traumatizing in itself. I mean, there are degrees of trauma, of course, but the constant second guessing of yourself in every moment is stressful. And it kind of breaks down your mentality day by day and moment by moment, where you constantly feel like you're in the middle of a fight and there's no respite from it. So what I've realized, and I'm sure others have realized it before me, but what I've realized is that what I need to do in my time, in my work, is consider, first of all, what is the inflection point, or rather, there is a weakest point of every wall. There is a weakest point of every structure. And rather than going at it with all of my strength, working smarter and figuring out what that thing is that will break apart this structure and loosen the bricks well enough for me to then be able to work my way through. And when I started thinking about it and thinking about it from that perspective, the answer was still a very, very difficult thing to achieve, but it suddenly felt doable. It made systems change real to me, because even the historically disempowered, even when provided with an opportunity to gain power, find difficult the understanding of power. I hope that kind of makes sense. And so when actually trying to work on it and solve the problem, the solution itself feels so impossible to grasp that it becomes impossible to achieve. And right now, what I'm working on is looking at challenges not as impossibilities and not as all-encompassing trials that I constantly have to run to the next finish line, and then what do you know, the finish line is actually further away. But instead look at it as hurdle after hurdle, with recognition that every hurdle is an achievement in itself, and recognizing that one day there will be a hurdle that will be the last one, and it turns from a hurdle into a swimming contest, and that's fine, and we can do something else. But so right now I'm trying to find that moment, that specific thing that I'm training for, and what all of this is going to lead up to. And it's the challenge to find that thing, but it's also encouraging to be able to hone it down and say, all I have to do is find that moment. And that's been helpful to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Bio. Wow, this has been an amazing discussion. I think we could have kept going and going. Also, to figure out what we do to bring that gigantic lower and middle of women in the social sector up into the next level. Bao, you touched on the stresses that you have, and we could have a completely another hour just on burnout alone, because I think that women in the social sector often feel that how can I have problems when look at the people that I'm trying to help are so much worse than I am. And so we just keep working harder and longer, and we don't put boundaries up for ourselves. But thank you, Anita, very much. We're looking forward to learning about the Gender Collective and how that unfolds. Ruchira, I'm not sure if you're still with us. I know she did say that she had an interview with Ashley Judd. So that would, sorry, you're on mute.
I have a book event for I Kick and I Fly with Ashley Judd. It's a fireside chat. And I can see people coming in, and I can see them through the glass doors as I wave.
Well, I must say that you've moved around the most of anybody I've ever seen in a Zoom call, and that's what makes it terrific. And Bio, thank you as well very much. And all of you who are joining us from wherever you are in the world, I hope you learned something. I certainly did. I'm excited, and I think it was just absolutely wonderful how naturally everybody was talking about the things that are near and dear to the Catalyst heart: systems change, collaboration, and working in a values-based way together. So everybody, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
bye-bye now.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.